Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Cizak, and I'm very happy to share with you the results, or some of the results, of my research on the Wadi Tumilat. The majority of my work on the site of Tel Maskuda and the Wadi Tumilat in general is based on the archival documentation of the Wadi Tumilat project. The project was a joint mission of RC, ASOR, and the University of Toronto, directed by late Professor Jack Holliday. It began its first field season in 1977 and continued the excavations at Tel Maskuda for 5 seasons between 1978 and 1985. In the meantime, conducting several surveys of the Wadi, directed by Carol Redmount. Unfortunately, since then, little of the material has been published. Fortunately, I was at the right place at the right time and was entrusted with this material a few years before Jack's passing. The Wadi Tumilat today is a narrow, intensively cultivated valley, some 52 kilometers long, but only 2 to 6 kilometers wide, leading eastward from the town of Abassa to Ismailia and the shores of Lake Timsah. It is one of the 2 main overland routes leading from the Nile Delta to the Sinai and Western Asia, and it is heavily traversed today. Wadi Tumilat was a strategically important corridor leading in and out of Egypt from the pre-dynastic period until the early Middle Ages. This trade route was initially facilitated by the Bedouin and nomadic inhabitants of the Sinai Peninsula via donkey caravans, but was eventually supplemented by a waterway, the so-called Canal of the Pharaohs, which increasingly became a significant strategic resource. Wadi Tumilat and its importance did not escape the attention of ancient rulers, historians, and geographers. Several written sources mention the area, all focusing on the ancient canal that ran through it. The oldest written record of the waterway existing in the Wadi Tumilat comes from 4 commemorative stelae of Darius I, all of which were erected along the wadi. Each stela was made of granite and was inscribed on both sides in hieroglyphic and cuneiform texts, Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The information on the cutting of the canal is given by the hieroglyphic versions, which are unfortunately poorly preserved, with many missing fragments in addition to being very hard to interpret. Since then, numerous ancient authors have mentioned the wadi and its canal in their writings. Some of the records are more detailed than others. However, they are often inconsistent and outright contradictory. Despite their shortcomings, once taken with a grain of salt, these sources allow us to gain insight into the history of the canal. The so-called Canal of the Pharaohs was the forerunner of the Suez Canal, which was kept in use with intermissions from the 2nd millennium BCE until the year 767 CE, when it closed for good. Although it is considered the ancient counterpart of the modern Suez Canal, the Canal of the Pharaohs followed a different course and linked the Nile to the Red Sea via Wadi Tumilat. We are still not sure who began working on the canal. Ancient authors and historians such as Aristotle suggested that perhaps its construction was started as early as during the 12th dynasty under the reign of Senwosret III, who began but did not finish the project. Aristotle's theory was supported by Strabo and Pliny the Elder. However, most of the ancient historians claim that the canal was probably first cut, at least partially, by Necho II in the late 7th century BCE, and it was either redug or possibly completed by Darius the Great. Necho's involvement in the works in the Wadi is supported by Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, and Strabo, although these authors seem to agree that the Saite works were also never completed. The majority of authors writing about Wadi Tumilat agree that the first successful cutting of the canal all the way to the Red Sea took place during the Persian period. This feat is supported by the already mentioned stelae commemorating this monumental achievement, known as Darius the Great Suez inscriptions. One of them, known from Tel Maskuda itself, reads, "Saith Darius, the king, I am a Persian, from Persia. I seized Egypt. I gave the order to dig this canal from a river by the name Nile, which flows in Egypt, to the sea which goes from Persia. Afterward, this canal was dug, thus as I ordered. and ships went from Egypt through this canal to Persia. Probably unaware of the existence of the stelae of Darius I, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Pliny the Elder all claim that the Persian king also failed at reaching the Red Sea, and stated that it was done only under Ptolemy II. His own stela, also found at Tel Mascuda and named the Pithom Stela by Neville, proclaims this by saying, "In the year 16, the 3rd month of his majesty, they dug a canal to please the heart of his father Atum, the great god, the living of Tekut, in order to bring the gods of Hent Ab. Its beginning is the river arm north of Heliopolis. Its end is in the Lake of the Scorpion. It runs towards the Great Wall on its eastern side, the height of which is 100 cubits verily, in order to drive away the rebels from these gods." Although Ptolemy II claims that his canal was the first to reach the Isthmus of Suez, thus allowing him to found a large city dedicated to his sister Arsinoe there, it is likely that this ruler only redug a silted-up canal which was built under Darius I. During the 2nd century CE, the freshwater canal was called the River of Trajan, and according to Claudius Ptolemaeus, it started right from the main Nile stream, north of the Egyptian city of Babylon. The last known direct reference to a functional canal in the Wadi Tumilat during the Roman period comes from the records of Lucian of Samosata, a public official and author in Egypt under the rule of the Antonines in 170 CE, who traveled from Alexandria to Clysma, or Arsinoe, at the Gulf of Suez via the Wadi Tumilat. Little is known of the conditions of the canal after that, although several papyri from around 423 or 24 CE mention some maintenance work that has been carried out as late as the late 5th century CE. Unfortunately, these papyri do not mention if the canal was preserved in its entirety at the time. Lastly, there are several sources written by Islamic authors that mention the canal. They generally agree on what its course was, the dates of its reopening and closing, and that by the mid-7th century CE it was completely silted up. It was permanently closed in 767 CE by the 2nd Abbasid Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. The real history of the Canal of the Pharaohs was most likely a combination of all of the above possibilities, and its final form was a result of an effort of all the mentioned rulers, and possibly those predating them by many centuries. A much more modest irrigation canal was likely cut along the Wadi to support settlements in its arid central and eastern sections as early as during the Hyksos occupation of the Nile Delta in the Middle Bronze Age. But let's circle back to that a little later. After antiquity, the Eastern Nile Delta, including the Wadi Tumilat and its canals, fell out of scientific focus and didn't draw any historical, cultural, or economic interest from Egyptologists and other Western academics for several centuries thereafter. It took an interesting turn of events to propel considerable scientific, scholarly, and popular attention of the Western world towards this region of Egypt. During a secret meeting of the Republic's Executive Directory that took place at the Luxembourg Palace on April 12, 1798, the French government finalized a deferral of a projected invasion of the British Isles. Instead, the directors decided to deliver an indirect blow against England and mount an expedition to Egypt under the command of General Bonaparte. Its main goals were to weaken the British positions in the east by fighting the Mamluk Beys who, according to the Directory, quote, oppressed French interests and most horribly maltreated French nationals residing in Egypt, end quote. Taking control of Egypt would also aid French commerce and communications with India, threatened by the British occupation of the Dutch Cape of Good Hope. It became necessary for the French to open a shorter, safer route to India that, aside from allowing better access to the Far East, would also allow them to, quote, attack the British satellites and wrest from England the source of her corrupt riches, end quote. The French forces landed at Alexandria on July 1, 1798, 36,000 men strong, borne in an armada of 400 ships. It was only 20 days later that Bonaparte defeated the rulers of Egypt at the Battle of the Pyramids, establishing French domination over the country. Soon, Napoleon turned his attention towards Wadi Tumilat. Having heard the stories of an ancient and magnificent canal, Napoleon expressed interest in finding the remnants of this passage. His interest culminated in a force of archaeologists, scientists, cartographers, and engineers scouring northern Egypt. Their findings, recorded in Description de l'Égypte, include detailed maps that depict the discovery of an ancient canal extending northward from the Red Sea and then westward toward the Nile. Later, Napoleon, who became the French emperor in 1804, contemplated construction of a north-south canal to connect the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. But the plan was abandoned because it incorrectly concluded that such waterway would require locks to operate, the construction of which would be costly and too time-consuming. Even if Napoleon's interest in the Wadi Tumilat was largely militaristic, the records of his surveyors and engineers are invaluable to reconstructing the course of and longevity of the Canal of the Pharaohs. For instance, thanks to the records of his engineers, we know that parts of the ancient canal still channeled water as late as 1861. After centuries of being absent from historical and geographical sources, the Canal of the Pharaohs reappears in 1822 in the records of Jacques-Marie Lapeyre, a French civil engineer tasked with surveying the Eastern Nile Delta. As Lapeyre recalls, the ruins considered as Abu Kichaid, which was the name of Tel Maskuta at the time, bore all the characteristics of an Egyptian city, and at their center stood a very remarkable Egyptian monument, a monolith of red granite sculpted in form of an armchair, on which three Egyptian figures are seated, that apparently belong to the priesthood, as one may judge from their costumes and headdresses they wear. The monument is still standing upright, and the figures are facing east. They were buried up to the waist, but as we dug down to their feet, we've been able to see the whole of them and measure them. The back of the armchair seat is completely covered with hieroglyphs that appear to be regular and complete. Among the ruins are many blocks of sandstone and granite inscribed with hieroglyphs, and all such remains that mark the sites of destroyed cities in Lower Egypt. After that discovery was made, and the names figuring on the backs of the statues deciphered, French engineers began to refer to this site as Ramses. This quote-unquote identification and the location of the site itself was one of the reasons why Tel Maskuta quickly became equated with the biblical Pithom, one of the cities which, according to Exodus 1:11, was built for the pharaoh of the oppression by the forced labor of the Israelites. Here's the site, still called Abu Kichaid, as recorded in 1818, along the mapped remnants of the ancient canal. And another, from 1826, this time spelled as Abu Kashab. Towards the end of the 19th century, the French name Ramses was already well established, as seen here on the 1886 map of Lower Egypt by the Geographic Society of Toulouse. Around 50 years after the French expedition abandoned the idea of constructing a canal in Wadi Tumilat, the International Commission for the Piercing of the Isthmus of Suez began building a canal between the Red and the Mediterranean Sea under the direction of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the initiator of the project. This wide-scale endeavor triggered another wave of surveys and rekindled interest in the Wadi Tumilat. A crucial utilitarian element of maintaining a project as massive as digging of the Suez Canal was cutting of the so-called Sweetwater Canal in the Wadi Tumilat. Its completion assured that the construction site in the isthmus had access to sweet water flowing via the Wadi from the Nile Valley, which in turn allowed the Suez Canal Company to employ larger numbers of workers. The Sweetwater Canal was also used to transport materials, food, and tools to the work zone between Kantara and Lake Timsa, where another service canal was constructed at the time. The Sweetwater Canal reached the Red Sea from the north and was accompanied by a railroad, which was used during the construction process and involved freight rail cars, which were adapted for earthworks, and for which the chief engineer and amateur archaeologist Félix Papineau received a patent later on. The renewed interest in Telamascuda was caused by discoveries made by Papineau himself. While the Wadi and its antiquities were already documented thanks to the French expedition, relatively little was known about individual archaeological sites. During the second phase of building the Sweetwater Canal in 1874 to 1877, Papineau ordered the construction of a so-called European village at the site, which was to house the offices and dwellings of the staff employed in overseeing the digging. He also built a stately house for himself and his family. These minor construction projects led to several important archaeological finds, many of which are still in the Papineau family collection. Luckily, Papineau was not a mere art collector. He was a gentleman and a scholar, and not only collaborated with contemporary Egyptologists such as Gaston Maspero, who published a pair of sphinxes found at the site, but also donated some of the monumental finds to the local authorities. Among the monumental statues uncovered by Papineau at Telamascuta was a second monolith of the same size and style as the Triad of Ramses II published in the Description de l'Égypte, allowing for the reconstruction of a monumental pair likely flanking an entrance to a temple. All of these finds, including a naos called Naos Papineau, a stela of Ramses II, the two before-mentioned sphinxes, and two granite triads of the same ruler are currently at the Ismailia Museum in Egypt. Following the archaeological free-for-all of the early to mid-1800s, with the dawn of the 20th century, Wadi Tumilat and Telamascuta was now the focal point of systematic archaeological works. First to begin his work at the site was Edouard Naville, who in 1883 was the first excavator of the Egypt Exploration Fund, set up a year prior by Amelia Edwards and Reginald Stewart Poole as a way to raise funds for more excavations in the Delta, which has been noted as being rarely visited by Europeans. Naville conducted limited excavations, but still uncovered a large quantity of textual material. He managed to also incorporate previously found objects into his short excavation report, publish a map of the Wadi listing several archaeological sites, the course of an existing canal and railway, as well as a top plan of Telamascuta itself. The plan, albeit simple, shows the location of long-gone ruins still visible on the surface in late 1800s, and the location of the Canal of the Pharaohs relative to the site. Among the material recorded by Naville were the Pithom stela of Ptolemy II, the Triad of Ramses II, Naos Papineau containing a sphinx of Ramses II, some other sphinxes, both Hyksos and Ramesside, as well as many fragments of inscribed objects and elements of architecture dating from the Second Intermediate Period to Late Roman period. Following Naville, Jean Cléda, a French engineer and archaeologist, worked in the Eastern Nile Delta and the Isthmus of Suez between 1901 and 1909. He carried out limited excavations on behalf of the French Institute of Archaeology and the Suez Canal Company. At Telamascuta, he reassessed Naville's results and obtained more textual material, including inscribed door hinges, fragments of statues, both in bronze and stone, as well as fragments of monumental limestone reliefs and inscriptions used in the construction of the enclosure wall. Unlike Naville, he didn't automatically assume the historicity of the biblical narrative, and instead focused on more grounded issues, such as routes of communication and the defensibility of the isthmus and surrounding areas. More importantly, however, Cléda surveyed Wadi Tumilat and the general area of the Isthmus of Suez. He mapped all visible remains of the ancient canal, with the Wadi and further within the Wadi and further south towards Suez. He also considered many possible trade routes connecting Wadi Tumilat with the Near and Middle East, while discussing the development of the economic relationship between Egypt and Syria-Palestine. He discovered and mapped several archaeological sites, most of them dating to the Ramesside period, and evaluated the historical situation in the frontier zone. He noticed that what he described as Ramesside fortresses were located along the border of Egypt, both north and south of the eastern mouth of the Wadi, and were often accompanied by stelae, likely serving as boundary markers. Whenever possible, he documented these structures and hypothesized about their involvement in long-distance trade and the defensibility of the region. These ruins were not exactly news at the time. They were already reported by Linnaeus de Belfond in 1872, but never garnered much scholarly attention before, and frankly even after Cléda brought them up in his reports. While the work of French engineers and later excavators is often heavily biased and very often misinterprets the archaeological evidence, the information they recorded turned out to be invaluable in reconstructing the history and archaeology of the Canal of the Pharaohs and the state of preservation of Tel Mascuda, before the intensifying agricultural activity managed to disturb many sites later identified by the Wadi Tumilat project. Even looking at the plans drawn by Neville and 2 decades later by Cléda, we can see the progressive deterioration of the sites, including the destruction of structures within the enclosure wall and the exposure of its northern section, probably due to the extraction of sebakh from the tel. While still visible, the site is endangered by the development of the modern settlement and agricultural activities of its inhabitants, and despite the most recent works at the site focusing on the monumental walls, it still requires urgent attention. And that brings us to today, or late 1970s, early 1980s, and the discussion of the results of the Wadi Tumilat project, augmented by my more recent re-evaluation of the site and survey data. It needs to be said that during much of antiquity, Wadi Tumilat appears to have been largely deserted. However, the Wadi Tumilat project survey managed to locate 71 sites, including 12 tells and possible tells, 44 shared scatter sites with no apparent architecture, 5 canal bank dredging piles, some of which also contain fragments of pottery and other artifacts, and 10 unclassifiable sites. Since the 1980s, more sites have been discovered and contributed to our understanding of the settlement pattern in the Wadi. In preparation for the Wadi Tumilat project surveys, the Wadi was divided into 3 so-called divisions, in which 42 transects, 2 by 1 kilometer, were drawn along the southern edge of the valley. 14 of these transects were then randomly chosen and subjected to a land survey. Additional information was sourced from a series of interviews with local farmers and an archival study of archaeological and geological documentation. In total, 24 sites were recorded in the Western Division, 34 in Central Division, and only 9 in the Eastern Division. Most sites were stratified and had archaeological remains from several periods. The Wadi Tumilat project survey and later finds of sites such as Hassan Dawood show that while human activity in the Wadi dates back to the Neolithic period, there were only 2 periods in which the Wadi was intensively occupied. The Second Intermediate period, when there was a considerable Hyksos presence in the Central Division, and the later Sayyid throughout early Roman periods. We will circle back to that later, but first let's take a look at the core of my research on this area. And begin with the Middle Bronze Age, or Second Intermediate period in Egypt. There were 21 sites with varying concentrations of Middle Bronze Age ceramics recorded in the Wadi, mostly located in the southern section of the Central and Western divisions, with one large tell in the northern section of each, Tel Mascuda to the east and Tel Rataba to the west. The sites formed a general pattern of a large tell, 1 to 2 smaller tells, and a number of temporary sites in between. The larger tells were most likely involved in the far-reaching trade network of the 15th dynasty rulers. Due to the limited arable land in the area, the Middle Bronze Age tells were not entirely self-sufficient. Thus, their auxiliary sites were probably involved in supplementary shepherding, hunting, fishing, and procurement of raw materials. Some of them may also be remnants of camps made by caravans traversing the Wadi. The majority of Middle Bronze Age sites, 61.9%, were found in the Central Division, while 28.5% were located in the Western Division. What's interesting, only a few Middle Bronze Age sites were located in the western section of the Western Division, which was the agriculturally favored part of the Wadi throughout most of its occupation, from the pre-dynastic all the way to the late Roman period. The preference for a more eastern location for settlements in the Middle Bronze Age was one of the reasons why we needed to consider the desert trade and its importance at the time. Tel Mascuda was the eastmost large tell in the Wadi Tumilat and at times the main settlement in the area. It was first settled during the Second Intermediate Period, when a fast-evolving settlement was established there in the mid to late 15th dynasty. After the end of the Hyksos dominance over the delta, Tel Mascuda lost its importance in favor of Tel Rataba, which was located in a more advantageous location. Only a number of Ramesside monuments indicate that some activity took place at the abandoned Tel. After a lengthy hiatus, the site was resettled and fortified during the reign of Necho II. In the Persian period, the town site expanded to fill the entire enclosure area, spilled over and expanded to the southwest. In the Ptolemaic period, the village flourished and was used for storing large quantities of grain. The presence of impressive granaries was likely one of the reasons why Telmasqueda was initially identified as the store city of Pithom by Neville. The intense occupation continued into the Roman and late Roman periods, however, to evaluate its extent, further research is necessary. From the start, Tel Mascuda was an unfortified village, probably 2 to 3 hectares in extent, and its archaeology closely parallels strata E1 through D3 at Tel Daba, the Hyksos capital in the delta. Even though Tel Mascuda was founded much later than Tel Daba, its earliest phases correspond well to those characterizing the beginnings of the older settlement. These early phases are distinguished by sinuous boundary walls, a steady progression in area use from above-ground circular silos and intramural burials to an increasingly dense pattern of houses and associated features, mostly related to agriculture, animal husbandry, cooking, and industrial processes. The architecture and material culture of Tel Mascuda correspond to those of Tel Daba, clearly delineating the cultural connection of the inhabitants of Wadi Tumilat with those of the Hyksos capital. However, a local ceramic and some aspects of burial traditions show influence not attested at Tel Daba, but having possible links to cultures of the inland Levant. In contrast to Tel Mascuda, which was established in one of the wider sections of the wadi, Tel Rataba was located at a natural narrowing of the wadi. It was first settled by the Hyksos, but at the beginning of the 18th dynasty an important walled Egyptian settlement developed at the same location. The first fortress at Tel Rataba was built by Ramses II. Approximately 100 years later, Ramses III replaced the old stronghold with a new, larger, and better fortified structure. In the Third Intermediate Period, the weakened Egyptian state was unable to maintain the fortress. However, a large, dense settlement developed on its ruins. Tel Rataba was inhabited also in the late period. Thanks to the finds of characteristic types of Tel Yehudia juglets, the hallmark of the Hyksos presence, as grave goods, the earliest Second Intermediate Period burials at Tel Rataba can be dated to possibly as early as the 14th dynasty. In comparison, similar forms are almost entirely absent from the ceramic repertoire at Tel Mascuda, which is characterized by decidedly later forms of this vessel class. Such dating indicates an eastward expansion of the Hyksos settlement pattern into the arid central division in the 15th dynasty, following an initial and continuing settlement at and around Tel Rataba in the 14th dynasty, which may reflect the growing ambitions of the late Hyksos rulers and shifting and intensifying connections with the Levant. During the mid to late 15th dynasty, Tel Mascuda became the primary tell in the area and an important node in the long-distance overland trade. Wadi Tumilat was not an ideal area to settle. It was dry with unreliable access to water. It was removed from the national core and lacked the last pastures of the delta surrounding other Hyksos settlements. The fact that the sites are concentrated in an arid and inhospitable location suggests a particular function and indicates that we may be dealing with a site system influenced by a major gateway city type settlement. According to A. F. Berhard, a professor of geography at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, such cities, quote, develop between areas of different intensities or types of production, and they are located towards the end of their tributary areas and are heavily committed to transportation and wholesaling." End quote. Thus, gateway cities are typically located at the entrance to a defined area and will be traversed by anyone coming in or leaving it. By definition, such settlements would be located at the frontier and almost always facilitate connections between the tributary zone and the outside world. Therefore, their service area would be organized differently than that characteristic of central places. They would span outwards, away from the national core, and reach their maximum density and productivity where the primary settlement was located. Berhard also gave valuable insight into the sequential development of gateway cities on a pioneer frontier. As the moving frontier crosses a region, gateway cities are spawned along its edge to serve the pioneer area beyond and link it back to the national core area. When the frontier has passed by, the formerly exclusively gateway settlements become more and more equipped with central place functions, serving an area more equally poised around them. As the frontier moved eastwards during the mid to late 15th dynasty, the settlement pattern grew and became more defined. It is possible that earlier during the Second Intermediate Period, the Wadi Tumilat did not have a big strategic or economic significance, and the main settlement overseeing the movement of people, goods, and animals towards and out of the Nile Delta was located further west. Tel Retaba, situated at a natural narrowing of the wadi, would be an ideal candidate for such a settlement. However, as the importance of the southern trade route into the Sinai grew, it became instrumental to better facilitate passage through the Wadi Tumilat. It is also possible that in order to sustain a settlement located farther east, an irrigation canal was constructed during that period. Such a canal would provide an additional mode of transportation and give access to water, which would otherwise not be available in the central division in amounts allowing for both household use and agriculture. The connection of Wadi Tumilat with both the southern and northern Levant during the 15th dynasty was complex, as evidenced by the ceramic repertoire of some of its sites. Imported vessels were present throughout all occupational phases at Tel Maskuda, but the most telling evidence were fragments of painted juglets. Some of them were imported, while most represented local imitations. Among the recorded sherds, parallels to several types of Levantine pottery can be identified, including Levantine painted ware, Syro-Cilician ware, and Cypriot white painted pendant-style juglets. The Middle Bronze Age was not the first, not the last period when the Wadi served as a strategically important corridor leading in and out of Egypt, and the Hyksos were not the trailblazers here, nor were they the last ones to cross the Sinai Desert. Thanks to both the preceding and subsequent use of the Wadi as a trade corridor, it is possible to discuss the 15th dynasty route in and out of Egypt in a broader chronological context. While the presence of a waterway definitely helped develop trade in the Wadi Tumilat, the exchange of goods and ideas across the desert was possible as early as in the Epipaleolithic and evolved through the Neolithic and Chalcolithic into the early Bronze Age. Focused on the procurement of copper, trade in these periods might have already been conducted along more than one route. Following the occupation in the Neolithic and pre-dynastic periods, Wadi Tumilat was deserted for the large majority of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. It was only with the arrival of the Hyksos in the Second Intermediate Period that it saw a rapid increase in occupation. After the fall of the Hyksos, written evidence indicates that Wadi Tumilat belonged to a military zone known as Cheku. Both the orthography of the word and the context of the references imply that Cheku was a district rather than a town, although its specific boundaries cannot be determined. During the New Kingdom, Wadi Tumilat was sparsely populated. According to the Wadi Tumilat project surveys, there was only one major active tell. However, written sources suggest a more complex network of fortifications. Identification of particular fortifications mentioned in the New Kingdom texts of archaeological sites is difficult. One exception is the fortress of Meren Ptah-Hetep Herma'at of Papyrus Anastasis VI, which can be equated with Tel Retaba. However, Tel Retaba was not the only site where Ramesside monuments are found. At Tel Maskuda, a number of contemporary monuments were present, despite the lack of occupational strata dating to the New Kingdom. Among them were a pair of sphinxes, a naos, a massive stela of Ramses II, and two triads of the same ruler, all of which should look fairly familiar to us by now. The earliest writing of Cheku was found on an inscription at Serabit el-Hadim in the Sinai, dated to the 7th year of Thutmose IV. The inscription belonged to Amenemhat, the troop commander of Cheku, who was also a royal messenger. It is worth noting that the earliest known writing of Cheku is attached to the name of a military commander, as might be expected given the strategic nature of this entryway into Egypt. Such high military officers associated with Cheku are further documented in Papyrus Anastasi V. Commander Kakamur of Cheku, here translated by Gardiner as Chief of Bowmen, was dispatched from the royal palace, presumably in Pi-Ramses, to pursue runaway slaves, who fled towards Wadi Tumilat. In his report, he writes that he reached Pa-Seger and Cheku, the Seger fort of Cheku. The Egyptian word Seger possibly derived from Semitic Segor, or some similar form, meaning a keep, fortress, or enclosure, which may indicate its past as a Hyksos settlement. This fort in Cheku is not the same as the Hetem fort, aka fortification of Merenptah Hetep Hermaat, mentioned in Anastasi VI, which could have been located somewhere around the Isthmus of Suez. These mentions are very promising, especially considering the Ramesside fortresses reported by Clada along the Isthmus of Suez. The presence of Ramesside settlements or military installations in the Isthmus of Suez, and even at the verge of the Sinai, are not surprising considering the New Kingdom role of the Wadi Tumilat in conducting long-distance trade or facilitating expeditions seeking raw materials. The course of the route can be broadly reconstructed based on the inscriptions of Ramses III from Wadi Abu Ghada in the Sinai and Tumilat Radadi in southern Negev. While the use of Wadi Tumilat in copper trade is not exactly new, a third inscription found in Taima in Saudi Arabia shows the extent of the far-reaching trade at the time and explains the development of robust fortifications at Tel Rataba. It is likely that the route used during the reign of Ramses III did not come out of nowhere, however, and was a result of a pre-existing, possibly smaller-scale route already present during the reign of Ramses II, which could explain the presence of the two monumental triads dedicated to Ramses II found at Tel Maskuda, as well as stelae and architectural remains located along the way towards the Gulf of Suez. It seems that, in the New Kingdom, the southern route might have been a reflection of the better-known, and definitely better-studied, ways of Horus, the military and trade route running along the Mediterranean coast into the Levant. The relatively lower number of fortifications in the Wadi Tumilat can indicate a lower military priority, as it was unlikely that a large army would traverse the challenging terrain of the Sinai Peninsula had any other option been available. It is also plausible that an attack from the desert was not considered a real possibility. So, to summarize, the intensity of settlement in the Wadi Tumilat fluctuated over time and may reflect several factors impacting the choice of location within the valley: climatic and hydrological conditions, political situation, as well as the presence and intensity of long-distance trade. Notice that only after the Canal of the Pharaohs was completed by Darius I, and later used during the Greco-Roman period, the entirety of the wadi was occupied. Before fresh water became available, the eastern division would not be habitable. Rainfall in the Wadi Tumilat is sparse, erratic, and insufficient to sustain the settled occupation. The ordinary Nile flood regularly reached the western section of the wadi, which was bounded by a large natural dike near Tel Rataba, but only exceptionally high floods reached the central and eastern division, replenishing Lake Timsa to the east and the many small lakes in the central section of the wadi. That's why the western end of the wadi was more heavily alluviated and had more arable land, thus being able to support a larger number of sites. The depressed western region of the wadi probably contained a perennially marshy lake sustained by the yearly Nile flood. In pharaonic times, it is not attested whether the lake subsequently slowly dried up, or whether it was fed by a Nile canal also outside of the flood season. Economic activities such as farming, grazing, hunting, and fishing in and around the lake could sustain permanent occupation in the area, unlike the arid and inhospitable Eastern Division. Even settling in the Central Division posed some challenges. However, the two tells located in that part of the Wadi, Tel Mascuda and Tel Rataba, prospered for centuries and show evidence of more or less continuous occupation. While the caravan trade thrived in the early and Middle Bronze Age, the scale of international exchange was greatly influenced and amplified by the presence and reach of the so-called Canal of the Pharaohs. Unfortunately, due to the limited research and despite my ongoing efforts, the extent of the trade network involving Wadi Tumilat at any given time is not well known and requires dedicated work, including further large-scale surveys along possible trade routes across central Sinai. The fact that the Wadi was an important trade corridor cannot be contested. The direction of such trade can also be inferred from numerous finds in the Wadi. However, the course of the overland trade routes remains somewhat of a mystery. Caravans crossed the Sinai from the early days of Egyptian civilization. Even with the climatic conditions during the early Bronze Age being less arid than those characteristic of the Middle and Late Bronze Age, traversing the desert was still a difficult feat that required ample resources, experience, and most importantly, access to potable water. Based on past and current geological maps of the Sinai Peninsula, numerous wells and sources of water can be mapped. They were present not only along the well-known ways of Horus, as the Karnak reliefs indicate, but seem to be located along the projected routes leading to both southwestern and southeastern Sinai, as well as across the central Sinai towards the Negev Desert and the Jordan Valley. An average donkey caravan, aiming to cover several hundred kilometers in arid or semi-arid regions, could reach an average daily travel rate of approximately 25 to 40 kilometers with a load weight of about 50 to 80 kilograms per donkey. Taking the lowest values into account, an experienced caravan could reach either Timna, Feinan, or Beersheba in less than 14 days, Sarabit el-Hadim in 10, Wadi Tar in 12, and the cluster of southern Sinai sites in 2 weeks. With the furthest distance between geologically feasible sources of water being approximately 70 kilometers, it is theoretically possible to follow that hypothetical route all the way across. The possibility of a trade route traversing the central Sinai as early as in the early Bronze Age calls for a detailed land survey similar to those conducted by Oren in the north and the Ophir expedition in the south of the peninsula. While such an expedition is yet to take place, recent techniques such as digital elevation modeling and remote sensing were implemented by Stewart et al. To extract anthropogenic features in the desert region using data from the first and second generation phased array type L-band synthetic aperture radar. The resulting photomosaic showed a clear difference between the geological formations and anthropogenic features, such as roads and buildings, which were clearly visible as highly reflective targets. Consequently, it was possible to detect man-made features in the desert environment and evaluate the presence of buried structures. And while it doesn't mean those structures can be dated to antiquity, their physical evaluation would be more than justified. Of particular interest are features identified between Wadi Tumilat and Jebel Magara, a sparsely developed hyper-arid area strategically located at a crossing point between routes and settlements that lie along the Wadi Tumilat and the plateau between the rock formations of Jebel Magara and Jebel Yelek. In this region, the pulsar mosaic revealed many, particularly linear, anomaly features indicating a possible presence of buried roads. The photomosaic of the area east of Ismailia showed a multitude of buried or semi-buried linear and nonlinear features, which are in line with the theoretical interpretation of the settlement pattern in the Wadi Tumilat during the Middle Bronze Age, as well as with the activity in the region during the Ramesside period. Now, even given the presence of a trade-oriented Middle Bronze Age settlement pattern in the Wadi Tumilat, and evidence of widespread and intensive contact with different regions of the Levant present at Tel Mascuda, the question of the Middle Bronze Age trade route and its course remains open. Studying imported pottery alone can't paint the complete picture, and much more work remains to be done in order to evaluate the extent of the connections between Wadi Tumilat and the inland Levant, the Negev Desert, and the Jordan Valley via the Sinai Peninsula. The pulsar data shows that road across the desert did exist. Whether they can connect these regions, however, remains to be seen. Bearing in mind that the ways of Horus had little significance during the Second Intermediate Period, the bulk of land trade could have passed through the Wadi Tumilat along a major overland route. With little tangible evidence, the logistics of such a connection are likely the key to understanding of the nature of such a route. What was the extent of the Southern Middle Bronze Age trade route between Egypt and the Levant? Where did it lead exactly, and what local economic and/or cultural boundaries did it cross? Which commodities would be traded by land? It is likely that if such a route existed, Wadi Tumilat would have played a major role in facilitating the exchange of commodities difficult to trade by seas, such as cattle or goods manufactured in specific geographical locations away from the shore. Now, to what extent is the Middle Bronze Age trade route reflected in the later and better documented New Kingdom network? If parts, or the entirety, of the southern route and Second Intermediate Period sites located along the way were adapted and expanded in the Ramesside period, as was the case of the scarce Middle Bronze Age settlements along the ways of Horus, maybe it is possible to hypothesize about its reach and direction. Building on my doctoral research, this study is still in its preliminary stages and definitely requires more work, ideally including a systematic targeted survey along the projected routes. However, I remain hopeful that as I make my way through the archives of the Wadi Tumilat project, more information will become available and eventually shed more light on the organization and functioning of the larger Hyksos trade network. Thank you all for listening.